Mark Catesby was the first person in the world to draw color drawings of birds in North America. He was one of the younger sons of a minister who was sort of mid-level in the Anglican Church in England. Didn't really have a career, wasn't good enough to go to college. So they sent him off to a cousin's plantation in North Carolina for a while to see if he could grow up and learn to do something. And what he learned to do was draw pictures of birds. And he traveled in Virginia, Carolinas, spent some time in Bermuda, went back to England, took his pictures, worked on them, got them published. They were the first publication anywhere in the world of birds in color from North America. And these are some of his drawings. Sorry, this is an old slide. That's Charles III, I'll have you know, not Prince Charles. The ivory-billed woodpecker, of course, was one of the birds he drew. This is the first known image ever made by a human being from Europe of the ivory-billed woodpecker. And it would have been quite common, of course, in the South in those days. It loved really dense forests and would have been a pretty amazing bird to see. George Steller was the first scientist to come to the west coast of North America. He was on a Russian boat. And if you go back, think about the early 1700s, were like 100 years before Darwin. The only place you really studied science in the world at that point was Germany. Religion would not allow you to muddle around with things that weren't in the Old Testament, but you could get by with it in Germany. So most of the doctors in Europe, hired by rich people like the Tsar, came from Germany. And George Steller was a young, scientifically trained doctor from Germany who was working in St. Petersburg. And the Tsar at that time decided he wanted to find out what was going on in the North Pacific. What did it look like? How many fur seals are there? How can we get rich by using the resources in the North Pacific? Because the Spanish weren't up there yet, so they were really interested. And of course, as we know, the Russians ended up on the coast of California and Oregon taking fur seals. But this was before that even started to develop. So Steller was assigned to the boat. And the guy who was running the boat was overbearing, and his name was Bering. He ended up killing almost everybody on the expedition because he was arrogant and ignorant, and he wouldn't believe a young 20-something German doctor who kept saying, we've got to eat plants or we're going to get scurvy. And Bering laughed him off the boat. And then he ended up wrecking the boat, but Steller and about 3 or 4 of the guys who worked with him, who knew he was smarter than Bering, got on an island in the winter and managed to survive, eating plants, catching fish. They took the wreckage of the boat, got themselves to Siberia the next spring, and Steller had managed to save all his journals. His notes and pictures were deadly accurate, or lively accurate, I should say. And this is the Steller's jay. And how did he know he was in North America when he saw that bird? Because he had seen Catesby's picture of the eastern blue jay with the crest. There are no crested jays in the old world. The minute Steller saw that jay with a crest, he said, we're in North America now. There was no map, nothing. But the crest told him everything he needed to know. Captain Cook was in the Pacific, of course, in the late 18th century. The wandering tattler here was one of the first birds that his doctor collected and sent back to London. Among Cook's discoveries, surfbird, California quail, a number of other things. And this was the first serious expedition from Europe that actually was paying attention to science. We all know Sir Francis Drake came out here in the late 1500s. He didn't care about science. Science didn't even exist in people's minds in those days. It was all about what can we get? What are the Indians eating? Can we eat that? Can we buy what they've got and sell it in Europe for more? They didn't take any notes on wildlife, habitat, none of that stuff. But Cook's expedition had a real trained scientific doctor, and they started collecting specimens that went back to London and Paris. The first important French expedition was La Perouse. It came up in the 1780s. Fortunately, as he headed across the Pacific from California and Oregon, he met up with an American boat in Hawaii, gave him all the journals and said, can you send that stuff to Paris? 4 weeks later, La Perouse and his whole expedition were gone. We don't know where they are, somewhere under the ocean. But their drawings from California and northern Mexico were saved because they had sent them back with an American boat to send them back to Paris. This is one of the oldest drawings we know of California quail. The only scientific expedition that the Spanish ever did was 89 to 94. And they found several species, but they didn't really communicate because of politics with the scientists in Germany, Paris, and London. So a lot of their discoveries were just sort of kept in a notebook. And when their stuff got back to Spain, it was so anti-Catholic that it was basically buried. Half the people on the expedition were locked in prison and never let loose. So it was the only attempt that the Spanish Empire ever made to be scientific on the Pacific coast, and most of the stuff got lost. William Bartram was a very important naturalist. He and his dad were basically plant collectors for rich British landowners who wanted fancy new stuff from the New World. So they would send them all kinds of plants that obviously didn't exist in Europe. When we spent time in London, one of the most common plants in yards in London is the California ceanothus. They love it. It loves the fog. It blooms. They can't believe it. They don't have any plants like that in Europe. So it became one of the most popular plants. The tallest tree in England, California redwood, planted about 170 years ago. It's 50 feet taller than any of the native trees already, and it's just a baby. But William Bartram was very important. He helped train all kinds of people who came through. Alexander Wilson, Meriwether Lewis, before he went on the Lewis and Clark expedition, was sent specifically to Philadelphia to spend 8 weeks with Bartram to learn everything Bartram could tell him about plants, birds, mammals in the United States. Alexander Wilson, we'll talk more about him, but a lot of the stuff he learned about birds, he learned from Bartram. And Bartram went to Florida at one point, and Kubla Khan, the romantic poem, was based on his journal about what it was like in Florida. Alexander Wilson came from Scotland. He was a poet and a radical, often goes together. Don't worry, Pepper, I'm not talking about you. Pepper's a good poet, by the way. He was jailed for sedition. They made him burn his poems in the town square. He said, "That's it, I'm out of here." His uncle gave him a rifle just as he got on the boat to come to the U.S. He never went back. Got off in Philadelphia. He was fairly educated, obviously, and literate, so he worked for printers, became a grade school teacher. But he was really fascinated by some of the birds, and he started drawing pictures. And he traveled quite a bit in the eastern United States, east of the Mississippi River. And these are some of his drawings, and if you study them, you go through his drawings, he drew almost as many birds as Audubon would do 15 to 20 years later. And a lot of the layout, Audubon copied. He ripped them off, did a more romantic, much more commercial version. Wilson was not a promoter, wasn't a clever organizer the way Audubon was, wasn't nearly as extroverted and able to get people interested, and he never went back to Europe where people were rich enough to buy things from Audubon. But Wilson was the first person to try to illustrate every known bird in North America, and he discovered a number of species that science in Europe didn't know anything about, and that's why he has several species named after himself. There's the phalarope. Then the Lewis and Clark expedition, one of the several things of genius that Jefferson organized after he did the Louisiana Purchase. Lewis was brilliant. He was trained by Bartram in natural science, but he was also bipolar, so he knew he couldn't run it alone. So he went to Jefferson and said, "I need to take my buddy Clark with me." So they became the team. Some days Lewis would spend all day in his tent, not even get dressed. Clark ran the expedition, but Lewis was the observing genius, and he took incredible notes. Almost everything he did, like Steller 100 years earlier, was deadly accurate. It was 80 years after his death before science admitted that he was right. The common poor will goes into the rocks and goes to sleep. Science couldn't accept that. They knew what migration was, and they knew what stay-all winter was. They had never heard of a hibernating bird. There is no such thing in Europe, so it can't be possible because all the European scientists knew that everything in America was primitive. If you were civilized and ahead of your time, you were in Europe. If you were primitive, you were in America. It took them almost 150 years to admit that hummingbirds could fly backwards. There was no bird in Europe that could do that, and they were not going to admit a bird in America could do what they couldn't do. Oops. When you think back on the expedition, it was pretty incredible. It was probably the last serious expedition, at least governmental, that didn't try to fight with the Native Americans. They made it all the way without anybody dying from violence. And they made an enormous number of discoveries, plants, animals, and just a lot about the habitat and what the geology was like. And Lewis was a really good observer, so he ended up getting a woodpecker named after him, and the Clark's nutcracker, of course, was named after his partner. It's one of the largest corvids in North America. The Clark's grebe is named after a different Army officer 80 years later, so it has nothing to do with Lewis and Clark. Discovered, I mentioned the poor will, and the other, of course, one of the most beautiful is the western tanager. All the tanagers back east are different scarlet, reddish colors, but to see one like that, they couldn't believe it when they first saw the specimens back in Philadelphia after the expedition was over. And a lot of these birds that they collected, that they got back, were either drawn by Wilson or later by Audubon for the first time in history. Thomas Say was a naturalist, not a doctor, but he was taken along as a naturalist on the next major expedition from the East Coast to the West, which was the Long Expedition, left from St. Louis in 1819, did the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. And Thomas Say was the naturalist, so of course he found Say's phoebe, indigo, or larger white bunting, lesser goldfinch, all kinds of birds of the prairie that had never really been noticed before. Lewis and Clark went up the Missouri River. These guys went across the dry land. They would follow the bison herd for 3 or 4 days sometimes. And so they discovered all kinds of dry land birds that no scientist had ever seen before. And here's 2 of his discoveries. Of course, the lesser goldfinch and the phoebe. And the phoebe genus is named after him in Latin. This is just some of the birds that they discovered. Clearly, these are not birds you're going to find in a forest in Illinois. Oh, God, I see the orange-crowned warbler. I did a couple, 3 years in a row, I guess. I was at Maggie Marsh, which is the big warbler festival in northern Ohio, as the birds are coming north in May and heading up to Canada into the forest. And I was sitting down on the boardwalk. It's like the 3rd day there, and people are getting really excited. They're seeing something on their cell phones, and they're going, "Oh my God, we got to get to the parking lot." Finally, I said, "What is it?" He said, "Oh, there's an orange-crowned warbler out there." I said, "You go for it." It was like the time I was in Texas and we were birding and we were seeing all these incredible birds, chachalaca and stuff were along the Rio Grande River. And there was 2 guys at this state park and they're pulling over the map and they're whispering about where they're going to find this bird. And, "Oh, it's in the parking lot. Oh, they saw it this morning. Oh, we got to go over as soon as I get off work." And we went out and birded for an hour, and I saw, I think, 5 lifers in 45 minutes. So we go back in to use the toilet. The guys are still going over the map, and curiosity got to me. I said, "What do you got?" He said, "Oh, there's a black phoebe in the parking lot down the road." I said, "We'll skip it. We're from California." So it's all what you're used to. Audubon was clearly the most important commercially and in many ways just spreading information of the early pre-Civil War, untrained but very adequately wise collectors. Our friend from Harlequin Center will recognize what this means. Audubon thought it was a good day in the field if he killed at least 100 birds. Took a shotgun. You didn't look at it. Nobody even started using binoculars. There was no such thing. If you're a birder and an artist, you kill them, take them back, look at them, and draw pictures. He was quite a romantic figure. Traveled a lot, lived for a while in Louisiana, tried to run a store a couple of times along the Ohio River, actually met Wilson once. When Wilson was traveling down the river, he went into Audubon's store, and Audubon looked at Wilson's drawings and thought, I can do better than that. And it was one of the things that finally inspired him to get going and get out of business because he wasn't a businessman. So his pictures, much more romantic, much more interesting, much more intensely emotional than the stuff that Wilson was doing. And he was also brilliantly organized. He met a Lutheran minister by the name of Reverend Bachman, who has a few animals named after him, who actually was a mammal expert, but he lived in the South and knew quite a bit about the local birds, including the warbler that Audubon named after him. And very cleverly, Audubon's two sons married Bachman's two daughters, who were brilliant artists. So most of the plants in the back of these pictures were drawn by the Audubon wives, the Bachman daughters. And there's the warbler. And there's Reverend Bachman himself. And he helped write the whole text for Audubon's mammal books, which came out after he was done doing the bird books. There's the wife. She sort of ran the family and the business. Particularly once they got wealthy, she was the one who managed where the money was going. Buick was really important to Audubon. Audubon realized that if he was going to sell those huge books that were his first editions, he was going to have to go to Europe where people had money. So he got on a boat, went to England, met a few people through some of the contacts he had in Philadelphia. And one of the first people he met was Thomas Buick. Buick was the ultimate woodcut artist in London in the early 1800s. In the book, if you look at a reprint of an English book about natural history or farms that was first printed in the 1820s, those are Buick's woodcuts. He was the ultimate nature artist in England at the time. He took one look at Audubon stuff and said, God, this guy's a genius. Took him around, introduced him to all his wealthy landowner friends who were collecting art and nature, and they had their little, collages of stuff, and they had collections of stuffed birds from Mexico and Peru and things, so to show off to how smart they were and how rich they were. Buick took Audubon around, and he must have sold about 130 copies to people that Buick directly introduced him to. So Buick got a win, even though he never came to North America. And I've got one of those in my yard. There's Buick. There's some of his original work. He never did color work. He did woodcuts. Swainson was another guy that helped Audubon a lot. I don't know how much of you know the history of Audubon, but he basically was a draft dodger. His dad said, get out of here. You're going to be in the Navy. During the Napoleonic Wars, you're going to get killed. Go to America, work with your cousin, don't come back. So he left as a teenager, late teenager, came to America, hadn't been back to France since. Swainson was a doctor and a pretty good bird artist. These are things on the right that he drew. The Raven, and he knew everybody who was anybody in Paris, Berlin, and London, and Edinburgh, where that's basically where science was at that point. So he took Audubon, who still spoke some French, to France and introduced him to all the rich scientists and collectors in Paris and helped him sell the rest of his books. So he got several birds named after him. And McGillivray probably did the hardest work of all. Audubon was pretty good at speaking English with a heavy accent. His writing was pretty much crap. So he locked himself in a hotel room in Edinburgh with McGillivray, who was William McGillivray, who was an artist as well, and a doctor and a scientist. And McGillivray took Audubon's notes and verbal chit-chat and turned it into a 10-volume set of bird biographies. So the Audubon bird biographies weren't written by Audubon. They were written by Scotsman William McGillivray, but he only got one mention in the introduction and got no credit as an author. But it was all Audubon's stuff turned into 10 volumes. And there's the warbler. And we've got those here in Oregon. This is McGillivray. He never came to North America either, but he does have a beautiful warbler. And this is some of his own art. All the tropical stuff and Western stuff, of course, is all done from dead specimens. This is my favorite Audubon story. Audubon's an old man. He's done all his bird books. He's working on mammals. So his sons, who are now in their 20s, and a bunch of their friends, might have included Thomas Lincoln, who got a sparrow that he shot up in Newfoundland, named after him. And they're heading up the Missouri River, west of where Kansas City is now. They're up around maybe where Omaha is today. And he said to his sons, go get that meadowlark. That's a new species. And they said, what are you talking about, Dad? It's just a meadowlark. It's like the meadowlarks we see all over the open ground in Ohio, and we've seen them in Pennsylvania. He said, no, that's a different species. I said, Dad, they all, they look just like meadow. He said, I don't care. And he whistled the Eastern meadowlark song and the Western meadowlark song and said, that's a new species. Audubon was a brilliant musician. He could play any song on the fiddle that he'd ever heard. Didn't need sheet music. He had music in his brain. That was a talent. He knew right away that's a different bird because he heard the song. He didn't need to see it. He knew the song was different. So, about 40 years after Lewis and Clark, 10 years after Nuttall and Townsend, other famous scientists had been out. Even Thomas Say he must have seen 15,000 meadowlarks when they're following the bison herd. Nobody knew it was a different species until Audubon, sitting on a boat, got gout, can barely walk, heard the song and said, no, that's a new species. Beechey was probably one of the most important expedition up and down the West Coast, went all the way up to Alaska, was in and out of the bay 3 times, tried to get up the Columbia River, and of course realized that it was the end of life if you do that, so he didn't, but did a lot along the Oregon coast. And he and his medical crew collected about 20 new species of birds up and down the coast, including some in Mexico. Nuttall was probably on the spectrum. He was totally focused on whatever he was doing at the moment. He came to America as like the ne'er-do-well youngest son of a guy who owned a little bit of land but didn't have any money and didn't have any future. And Nuttall was smart and interested. He liked printing. He liked books. And he worked for a printer in Philadelphia. Then he got interested in birds. And once he got in trees, and once he got interested, there was no stopping him. So he wrote the first guide to North American trees. He was the first natural scientist hired by some place called Harvard up in Boston. He taught there for 10 years. This is a guy who didn't graduate from high school. But you want to know something about a plant? This is the guy to ask. And in his spare time, he wrote the first handbook to American birds. He milked all the information from all his friends in Boston and Philadelphia, which were the main centers of science at that point, because the Smithsonian hadn't really gotten started yet. And he put it into a handbook of North American birds. And when you look at it, it was still in print. I've got a copy printed in 1890s. So it was 60, 70 years old before they stopped printing that book. It was so thorough and so complete and so accurate. And he and Townsend got a chance, but Townsend had been one of his students. He was now a medical doctor, but still in his 20s. And a rich guy in Boston decided he was going to send a bunch of fur trappers out to work along the Columbia River and asked Nuttall and Townsend if they wanted to go along. Nuttall said, great, quits his job at Harvard and walks across the country. He and Townsend were the first scientists to walk the entire width of the United States. And they did this in the 1830s. And there's a place on Sylvie Island, and I don't know why they don't put up the right sign. It's called Fort William. That's where they stayed overnight with the trappers on Sylvie Island when they got to the near the mouth of the Columbia River. But they discovered all kinds of new species, including the magpie and the black oyster catcher. And of course, there's birds named after both of them, and the western gull. And there it is, Townsend's warbler. And its Latin name is Tone. Tomei. Dr. Tomei and Dr. Townsend both worked for Hudson Bay Company around some place called Fort Vancouver, I think it is. That's a suburb of someplace up there. And they worked together and knew each other really well for about 3 or 4 years. And one day, Tomei brought in this specimen of this bird and handed it to Townsend and said, I shot this up in the mountains about a year ago. You'd be interested in that. And Townsend took one look at it and went, oh, wow. And so he wrote a description of it and had the description sent back to Philadelphia. And the scientist there, because he wrote the description, named it after him. But he didn't name it after himself, but it was named after him because he wrote the first scientific description of the Townsend warbler. Gamble was another protege of Nuttall from back east, and he went down the southern route, went into the Southwest, and into California, helped a few miners. This was before the gold rush, but he helped a few miners, or actually, it was during the gold rush, on an island in the Sacramento River, and they had an infectious disease. He got it and died. So he died fairly early. But during his early expeditions, he made a bunch of discoveries, mostly in California and in the Southwest, including the quail. He sent the quail back to Philadelphia, and they named it after him. John Casson was a bench scientist. He didn't travel a lot. He did fight in the Civil War and spent a long time in Andersonville in the prison. But he was the guy back east. If you had a new bird and you wondered what it was, he was your taxonomist. And he might spend weeks or months going over it and going, I don't think this is a finch. And he would finally figure out what it was. And he started cooperating with a guy by the name of Baird, and we'll get to him in a minute, who was running the Smithsonian and starting to build a bigger collection of bird specimens than they already had in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was the first center of science. I don't know how much you know about that period in American history, but the Quakers allowed science, the other religions didn't. So if it's 1770, you're not studying science in New York or Richmond, Virginia. You want to study science, you better go to Philadelphia, because that stuff is sin. It's not in the Old Testament. You can't talk about that. So most of the early science was based in Philadelphia, where Casson was. And the academy there had first real collection of specimens from across the country until the Smithsonian got started. And he became a collaborator with Baird. If Baird were to get something new from some guy named Ben Dyer out in the West, he would send it up to Casson, and Casson would spend a few weeks studying it, maybe go to Washington for a week and look at all the collection they had there and try to figure out whether it was really a new species or not. These are a couple of the birds he's got. Of course, our mountain finch out here, and the auklet. The wren-tit was really interesting. Casson called it, I can't remember what he called it. He didn't call it wren-tit, but he was the first person to publish a book with a picture of one that had been found by Gamble. It was sent back to Philadelphia, of course, and he took a look at it and went, wow, this is not related to anything around here. This is really weird. We now know that it's the only member of its family from Asia that made it to North America and survived. The wren-tit and the bush-tit are the two species on the West Coast that have no cousins in North America. They both got across the land bridge. They got down south, forced down probably by Ice Age, and they have no near relatives anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. They are both Asian species of bird. And the wren-tit is even more incredible because I've led a few trips with people like from places like Colorado where they're never going to see a wren-tit. It's high on their list. So I take them to Fort Stevens, because once you cross the Columbia River, there is never, and there never will be, wren-tit. They're not going to fly across a mile of water. These are the most sedentary birds you will ever experience in Oregon. They might move 40 or 50 feet one direction or another during their lifetime. They're not going to go across that river. There are bush tits that spread around, but these guys are very sedentary. Hierman was a German-trained doctor who ended up working for various government agencies in the 40s. He came to the Williamson River with Williamson. He was the doctor and the scientist. And so he discovered both the sapsucker that Williamson got named after, and he discovered this gull. He also made a bunch of other really interesting discoveries. He was shopping in San Francisco in the food market, and he picked up a bird and went, "Ooh, new species." Somebody had killed a tricolor blackbird and put it on the market for a couple of pennies, and he knew that was a new bird. It was a Williamson sapsucker. One of the fascinating things about this bird is the female and the male were discovered at different times in different places, and it took almost 50 years before a scientist realized they were a pair. They were male and female. They weren't two separate species because they're so different. Baird was a collector of collectors, and he was brilliantly organized. He became the number two guy at the Smithsonian and eventually took it over. But from the beginning, he was very interested in animal specimens, not just birds, but birds were one of the things he really liked. And he had a father-in-law who happened to be a big shot in the Army, the quartermaster. So he'd go to his father-in-law and say, "Let me send a doctor out to Fort Blankety Blank in eastern Wyoming because we've never had anything collected out there. So Ben Dyering's up in Harney County. You get famous names. Xantus gets sent to the Hatchby Mountains. I mean, all these people have birds named after Hutton. Gets sent to Southern California. This guy is the guy that fixed it. He'd send him out with cases of alcohol to preserve the specimens in and barrels so they could store the stuff until it got back to Washington, D.C. He collected, if you look at the names, Hammond, Ben Dyer, Cows, Kennecott, Cooper, that has the hawk named after him. This guy sent collectors all over the Western United States from the 1840s through the 1870s, collecting specimens from places where there were no previous natural history records. He was an organizer. His daughter Lucy was named for Lucy Audubon, the wife, and she's the one that has the warbler named after her. And William Hutton was a very important birder in Southern California, and he got the Casson named this vireo after him. Hammond was another guy, a doctor, sent west to several forts in the west by Baird. Thomas Brewer was slightly different. He was independent, fairly wealthy, got into publishing even though he had scientific training, but his hobby was collecting. And he would ask people to send him specimens who were out in the West. He didn't do a lot of traveling himself. He basically was a huge collector. And he helped write the first complete natural history of North American birds, multiple volumes, where they would go species by species and talk about them. And Casson named the sparrow after him, and of course the blackbird. But the most interesting thing was there was a young man by the name of Charles Allen who did some, he was from a blue collar family, did some work for the Brewer family. And he joined the Army during the Civil War, got badly injured, also taken prisoner. By the time he gets back to Boston, his PTSD is bad enough he cannot stand to live in the city. And Brewer loaned him enough money to get to the West Coast. So Allen finds himself a job as a gamekeeper for some rich French folks who fled after the Napoleon Empire went down, called Maillards. And if you live in the Bay Area, you know the Maillard family have been around and important in the Bay Area since about the 1840s. And they owned a huge ranch out in Marin County, north of Golden Gate Bridge. And Allen became their gamekeeper to basically keep the wolves out of the cows. And he would collect birds and send them back to Brewer because Brewer had helped him escape from what was too much for him to deal with. And he discovered this little hummingbird, and he wrote a note saying, this is nothing like any hummingbird I've ever seen before. I think it's a new species. And Brewer confirmed it and named it after Allen. He's the only California person with a bird named after him, Charles Allen. He also was intrepid in spite of his feelings in the Civil War. He was fascinated by Hermann warblers. He would see them when he went up to Lake Tahoe. They're just amazing. Finally, without chains, without rope, without ladders, He climbed hand over hand 180 feet up a Douglas fir and found the first hermit warbler nest ever seen. He did it himself. Incredible. And he was quite a good teacher. There was a young, grandson in the Maillard family who was interested in birds, followed Charles Allen around all the time. Charles Allen told him everything he knew about all the local birds. That guy became the first ornithological curator at the California Academy of Science in Golden Gate Park and wrote the first book about San Francisco birds. Anna's hummingbird was first discovered by a guy by the name of Bota. If you've ever lived in California, you're familiar with Bota's ground squirrels because they hang out near the sidewalks in big cities and drill under the sidewalks. Botta. He was an Italian who was on a French expedition, but it was paid for by a French nobleman who ruled a big section of Italy after Napoleon. So when Bota gets back with his collection, including the Anna's hummingbird that he found in the Presidio in San Francisco, the Duke of Messina decided he would name it after his wife because she hated his stinky animals that were stuffed in the castle, and he tried to placate her by giving her the most beautiful bird he'd ever seen. So that's how Anna, Duchess of Rivoli, got her own hummingbird. She did not come to North America to see it. Bonaparte was a nephew of the original Napoleon Bonaparte, and he fled Europe when the family didn't look like it was doing too well. And he was also interested in science, traveled a lot around the East Coast. Because of his name and connections, he fit right in with the crowd in Philadelphia. And he found about 15 new species while he was here, traveled in Canada, went down into the Caribbean. And this is his namesake gull. His wife's name, Zemeda. So she has a whole dove family. Franklin was the explorer, and I'm sure you've read about it if you read the history. It's the expedition that disappeared in the Hudson Bay, and they all froze to death and starved. And they finally started finding the boats and some of the wreckage just a few years ago. He was the one who collected this gull early on with a German scientist by the name of Forster, who also collected a tern. So Franklin came at least 3 times to Canada in one of his early expeditions. He found this gull. This woman is, I think I can say that even though I am just a male, that she is probably the most important woman in the history of American ornithology, or certainly in the beginning, up until at least the mid-20th century. Her name is Florence Merriam, and if you've studied the history of natural science in this country, her brother, Hart Merriam, ran the U.S. Biological Survey for about 40 years. So he hired scientists to go all over the western United States, collect stuff, bring it back to Baird, and do this, do the studies, how many wolves are there, what kind of deer, what kind of rabbits. She met one of the scientists, Mr. Bailey. They got married. So every summer, she was on the expedition with him. They're traveling, and they'd spend 8 weeks in New Mexico or 6 weeks in Montana. So she spent an enormous amount of time in the West. She'd already been out here once. She had pneumonia as a kid, 15 or 16, got sent to a friend's ranch near San Diego to recover, was there for a year and a half, and started birding from the back of a horse. And the first book she wrote, she was about 20 years old, Birding on a Bronco. Nobody had ever written a book. It's certainly not a woman writing a book about birds. Unheard of. Then she wrote probably the most revolutionary book in American birding history, Birds Through an Opera Glass. She didn't shoot them. She didn't trap them. She didn't kill them. She watched them with an opera glass. In those times, they were like 3 power because they were for watching operas. But she took them out in the field and completely changed the future of ornithology, and wrote a book about birds through an opera glass. Nobody had ever even imagined that before. Nobody carried binoculars in the field. She did. And then later, after she'd done a lot of travel with her husband, she wrote the first book on all the birds of New Mexico. And most importantly, she wrote the first field guide to Western birds. By that time, Chapman and other people, starting with Nuttall, had written lots of books about the eastern birds. Nobody had put together a book on all the birds of the West. And she did something revolutionary in that book. All the previous handbooks were basically written for guys with shotguns. So there'll be lots of information about how long the third feather on the wing is, or how big the tail is, or how long the beak is, what they look like when they're lying dead on a table. Nothing about behavior. It didn't matter. Shoot the damn thing, take it home, look at it, and figure out what it is. That's what birding was like in those days. She starts to put in behavioral information. They feed on the ground. They nest high in a tree. And then she blew everybody's mind because she put in real measurements. If you've got a dead mourning dove, you don't need somebody telling you it's 9 inches long. If you're looking at one in a tree, it's useful to know that a bush tit is 4¼ inches and a robin is 10 inches. That's really useful information. And she started putting that for the first time in history in any field guide anywhere on the planet. She put in measurements, blew everybody's mind. Finally, 30 years later, when she's at least this old or older, she was the first woman, of course, elected to the American Ornithological Union because she had become so important in bird science. So, Florence Bailey. Questions? I didn't do all the names, but I did quite a few. Anybody got any questions about any of this stuff? Yes. Test.
Thank you. This is very, very interesting. I'm a Lewis and Clarkophile. What's a really good book to on the expedition that talks about the birding and stuff?
There's a couple of books. I don't know whether I brought them with me. There are a couple of books on that are specifically on the natural history. In fact, here's one right here. Take my email, I'll loan it to you. But you have to eventually give it back. But yeah, that's a good one. There's several others, and there are journals from the expedition that have been published, I think by the University of Nebraska, that are verbatim. And some of the first journals that were published were from people on the expedition, but not Lewis and Clark. There were a lot of, they handpicked a lot of these people that were smart. Might be a corporal, but he's smart. He's not, just feeding the horses. He's taking notes. There are several journals that were published before Lewis's journal. And interestingly, the first guy who edited a version of Clark and Lewis's journals was, I hate to say it, I hope there's nobody in the room that's a lawyer. He was a lawyer. So he cared about money, trade with the Indians, how expensive things were, was it dangerous? He didn't give a about natural history. So we edited out all that stuff. It was almost 80 years after the expedition that a naturalist finally published all of Lewis and Clark's stuff that was full of natural history information. But traders in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, they didn't give a damn about birds. They want to know, is there fur? How much money can we make? How big are the trees? Can you grow wheat? Can you, that kind of stuff. That's what they wanted. So he edited out all the natural history. So it was almost 80 years before people got to read what Lewis and Clark had actually seen. The first experience of an Eastern person with a California condor. They killed one. They shot one out of the air up along the Columbia River. We think it was the youngsters would come up here. There's never been a confirmed nest site in the state of Oregon, but they were regular up here. And, you think about it, he's born, a cliff face someplace down by Chico. 3 days, he's on the Columbia River with mom and dad are not here to compete anymore. So he's got the whole river to himself. And in those days, the condors love dead sea mammals. So the Oregon coast and the mouth of the port of the Columbia River were perfect for them in warm weather. And then they just, in September, they'd drift back down to California where it was warmer.
Any quick? At the risk of making your head explode, Harry, why don't you tell us what you think about the movement to get rid of all of these explorers' names and make the birds named only after their appearance and characteristics rather than the names of people.
I think we will lose a fair amount of history. And, you know, I was a history major and spent my life in journalism. So names and nouns really matter. They bring up memory. So I think in many ways it would be sad. I mean, I know what some of the impulses are to do it. But when I talked about Thomas Say, you know, they talk about, you know, Audubon owned slaves. Yeah. So I understand that. But so did Washington. Are we going to rename every Washington street and high school in this country? I can't imagine we've got the guts to do that. And to take Thomas Say's name off, I mean, that guy is as close to a saint as anybody I've ever read about. He never did anything that you and I wouldn't go, wow, that was great. And he's got both a genus and a species. You know, nobody in history, or very few people in history, are blameless. So, you know, I'm not in any position to have any influence on it. I think over time, it may just wear out. Trying to, you know, taking some of the, like Steller's Jay, that guy died of pneumonia in Siberia because he got in a fight with the Cossacks who were beating the crap out of the Inuits around them. And he said, you shouldn't do that. These people are helping you fish there. And they threw him in prison. He got pneumonia. His stuff, he never got back to St. Petersburg, but all his journals did. They were perfect. They were full of great drawings, perfect descriptions. One of the most important things, and none of us will ever see this, but there was an animal called a Steller sea cow. And he was the only human being scientist to ever see that animal. And people looked for it later because they'd found everything else that he talked about, Steller sea eagle, Steller's eider. They could find that stuff. They knew where to look. Nobody could find a Steller sea cow. Finally, a Norwegian scientist working for the Smithsonian in the late 1800s, we're now talking 140 years after Steller has died, decides to get a couple of rich people to give him a boat, and he goes and explores the North Pacific, goes to every island off of Alaska. He had read all of Steller's stuff. Nothing Steller said wasn't 100% accurate, except this animal. And people try to say, oh, it was just a walrus carcass. He didn't know what he was doing. And this guy's going, no, he knew what he was doing. Looked around, he finally found a skeleton. The Russian fur traders had driven it extinct. It was a manatee. It swam 3 miles an hour. You want half a ton of blubber? There it is. You shoot it, you eat it for 3 weeks. So they wiped them out. They were extinct by the time real scientists after Steller got to Alaska, and they never saw one. Nobody bothered to look for the carcass until finally Steiner did and proved that Steller had been right all along. So I think we'd lose a lot of history if we change the names, but I can't predict what's going to happen.
And what you're saying is this manatee,
No Pacific manatee.
is now extinct,
Yeah.
or was extinct a long time ago.
Yeah.
But also, was it very much like, do we know the manatee in
Yeah.
Florida?
Yeah, that's how they finally identified what it was. The skeleton looked like something you'd pick up in Florida, or the dugong. Where's the dugong? He's in Australia. Yeah. And New Guinea in that area. Yeah. Yeah. Looked just like it.
Thank you.
So his description was absolutely accurate. Yeah, it was big. Yeah, well, it had to be in the cold water. You need all the fat you can get.
Any more questions?
Any other questions?